Chapter 1. Jean Valjean. One evening in October 1815, an hour before sunset, a man with a long beard and dusty, torn clothes walked into the town of Digne. He was in his late 40s, of medium height, broad-shouldered and strong. A leather cap half hid his face, which was sunburnt and shining with sweat. His rough yellow shirt was unbuttoned, revealing a hairy chest. On his back was a heavy soldier's bag, and in his hand was a large wooden stick. The townspeople, who had never seen him before, watched with interest as he stopped for water at a fountain. Children followed him to the marketplace, where he stopped for more water at another fountain. He then crossed the square towards an inn, and entered by the kitchen door. The innkeeper, who was also the cook, was busy with his pots and pans, preparing a meal for a group of travellers who were laughing and joking in the next room. "What can I do for you, monsieur?" he asked without looking up. "A meal and a bed," said the stranger. "Of course." The innkeeper turned to look at him. Then, seeing the visitor's rough appearance, he added, "If you can pay for it." "I have money." The stranger produced an old leather purse from his jacket. "Then you're welcome," the innkeeper said. The stranger smiled with relief and sat down by the fire. He did not see a young boy run out with a note that the innkeeper had quickly written. He did not see the boy return a short time later and whisper something to the innkeeper. "When will the meal be ready?" the stranger asked. "I'm sorry, monsieur," the innkeeper said. "You can't stay here. I've got no free rooms." "Then put me in a stable. All I need is a quiet corner somewhere. After dinner—" "You can't eat here either," the innkeeper interrupted. "I haven't enough food." "What about all that food in the pots?" The innkeeper approached, and bending towards the man, said in a fierce whisper, "Get out! I know who you are. Your name is Jean Valjean. You've just been released from prison. I can't serve people like you here." The man rose without another word, picked up his bag and stick, and left. Outside it was growing dark, and a cold wind was blowing from the mountains in the east. The man looked around, desperate for somewhere to spend the night. He tried another inn, but the same thing happened. He knocked on the doors of people's houses, but news of his arrival had quickly spread, and nobody would offer him shelter from the cold. He even tried sleeping in a garden, but was chased away by a dog. Finally, he found himself in the cathedral square. He shook his fist at the church. And then, cold and hungry, he lay down on a stone bench by the doorway. A few minutes later, an old woman came out of the cathedral and saw him lying there. "What are you doing?" she asked. He answered angrily, "Can't you see? I'm trying to sleep." "On this bench? In this cold wind?" "I've slept for 19 years on a piece of wood. Now it's stone. What's the difference?" "Why don't you go to an inn?" "Because I haven't any money," he lied. The old woman opened her purse and gave him a few coins. Then she said, "Have you tried everywhere?" "I've knocked at every door." "What about that one, over there?" she said, pointing across the square to a small house beside the bishop's palace. The Bishop of Digne was a kind old man who, many years earlier, had given his palace to the town hospital. He lived a simple life, with his sister, Mademoiselle Baptistine, and his old servant, Madame Magloire, and he was much loved by the people in the town. He trusted everyone. His doors were never locked, so that anybody who needed his help could find him easily. That evening, Madame Magloire was chatting with Mademoiselle Baptistine before serving the meal. "People say there's a stranger in town," she said. "The police say that he looks dangerous, and it would be better for everyone to lock their windows and doors." "Brother," Mademoiselle Baptistine turned to the bishop who was sitting by the fire, "did you hear what Madame Magloire was saying?" "Something about a dangerous stranger walking the streets?" he asked with an amused smile. "This is no joke," Madame Magloire said. "The man is in rags, and has an evil look on his face. Everybody in the town agrees that something terrible will happen tonight. And your sister agrees with me that this house isn't safe. If you like, I can make arrangements now to get a lock put on the door." Before the bishop could reply, there was a heavy knock on the door. "Come in," said the bishop. The door opened, and Jean Valjean, the stranger, walked in. Madame Magloire trembled open-mouthed with fear, while Mademoiselle Baptistine rose from her seat with alarm. The bishop, however, looked calmly at his unexpected visitor. "My name is Jean Valjean," the stranger said before anybody could speak. "I've been in prison for 19 years. They let me out 4 days ago. I've been walking all day, and nobody in this town will give me food or a bed for the night. A woman saw me lying on a stone bench across the square and suggested that I come here. So, here I am. What is this place? Is it an inn? I've got money. Will you let me stay?" "Madame Magloire," said the bishop, "will you please prepare another place at the table for this gentleman?" Valjean took a step forward. "No, you don't understand," he said. "I've spent 5 years in prison for violent robbery. Another 14 years for trying to escape 4 times. I'm a dangerous man." "Madame Magloire," the bishop went on, "you must put clean sheets on the bed in the spare room." Madame Magloire, an obedient servant, left the room without protest. The bishop turned to the man. "Sit down and warm yourself, monsieur. Supper will soon be ready." Jean Valjean's face, which had been hard and fierce, suddenly softened. "You really mean it?" he asked, his voice trembling with childish excitement. "You'll let me stay? I'm a dangerous criminal, but you called me monsieur. I don't believe it. May I ask your name, sir? Are you an innkeeper?" "I'm a priest," said the bishop, "and this is where I live." "A priest?" Valjean said, sitting by the fire. "So I don't have to pay." "You can keep your money," the bishop replied. During dinner, Mademoiselle Baptistine looked at Valjean kindly while the bishop talked about the local cheese-making industry. Valjean was so hungry that at first he paid no attention to anyone. Soon, however, he began to relax and looked around the room. "This is not the house of a rich man," he thought, "and the travellers in the inn eat better than this." But then he looked at the table and saw the beautiful silver candlesticks, knives and forks. After dinner, the bishop said good night to his sister, picked up one of the 2 candlesticks, and handing the other to his guest, said, "I'll show you to your room, monsieur." Valjean followed the bishop upstairs into a bedroom. This was the bishop's bedroom. As he was following the bishop across the room, however, he noticed Madame Magloire putting the silver knives and forks in a cupboard by the bed. The bishop showed his guest into the spare room. "Sleep well," he said. "Before you leave tomorrow, you must have a bowl of warm milk from our cows." Valjean was so tired that he fell asleep, fully dressed, on top of the sheets. But he didn't sleep for long. When he woke up, the cathedral clock was striking 2. But he had not woken because of this. He had woken because the bed was too comfortable. He had not slept in a proper bed for 20 years. Unable to return to sleep, he gazed into the darkness, thinking about the past 20 years. Life had been unjust to him, and he was angry. In 1795, he had lost his job as a tree cutter. At that time, he was looking after his sister, whose husband had died, and her 7 children. Out of work, and with no food in the house, he had been arrested for trying to steal a loaf of bread. Now, at last, he was free. But he felt bitter and angry about his lost years. The world had been unfair to him, and he wanted revenge. Then, remembering the silver on the bishop's table, he had an idea. He sat up, swung his feet to the floor, and slowly stood up. The house was silent. He moved carefully towards the window and looked out. The night was not very dark. There was a full moon, hidden from time to time by large clouds, moving quickly across the sky. After studying the garden, he decided that escape would be easy. He turned back to the room, picked up his bag, and took out a short iron bar, sharpened at one end. He then put his shoes into the bag, and grasping the iron bar in his right hand, he moved quietly towards the door of the bishop's bedroom. It was half open. The bishop had not closed it. Valjean stood listening. There was no sound. He gave the door a gentle push and crept into the bedroom. Just as he reached the side of the bishop's bed, the moon came out from behind a cloud and filled the room with light. Valjean gazed down at the bishop's gentle, sleeping face and felt a kind of terror. He had never before seen such peace, such kindness, such trust. He suddenly turned away and moved quickly to the cupboard. The first thing he saw when he opened the door was the basket of silver. He grabbed it hurried back to the spare bedroom, picked up his stick and bag, climbed out of the window, emptied the silver into his bag, and threw the basket into the garden. A minute later, he climbed the garden wall and disappeared into the trees. Early the next morning, while the bishop was studying the flowers in his garden, Madame Magloire ran out of the house with a look of alarm on her face. "Monseigneur, do you know where the silver basket is?" "Yes," said the bishop. "I found it in one of the flower beds." "But it's empty," she cried. "Where's the silver?" "Oh, you're worried about the silver. I don't know where that is." "Heaven save us! It's been stolen," she cried. "The man who came last night, he's run off with our silver." The bishop, who had been bending sadly over a plant damaged by the basket, looked up and said gently, "I think I was wrong to keep the silver for so long. It really belongs to the poor. I should have given it away a long time ago." Later that morning, as the bishop and his sister were having breakfast, there was a knock on the door. 4 men walked into the room. 3 of them were policemen. The 4th was Jean Valjean. "Monseigneur," the sergeant in charge of the group began. Valjean raised his head with surprise. "Monseigneur?" he repeated. "I thought he was a priest." "Silence," said one of the policemen. "This is the Bishop of Digne." The bishop, meanwhile, had moved towards the group of men and was smiling at Jean Valjean. "I'm delighted to see you again, dear friend," he said. "But what about the candlesticks? I gave you those as well. Don't you remember? They're silver like the rest, and worth at least 200 francs. Did you forget to take them?" Jean Valjean's eyes widened with disbelief. "Monseigneur," said the sergeant, "do I understand that this man was telling the truth? We found this silver in his bag, and he told you—" The bishop finished the sentence for him, "that an old priest had given it to him. Yes, he was telling the truth." "So this man isn't a thief?" The sergeant looked as surprised as Valjean. "Not at all. So you can let him go at once." The policeman let go of Valjean's arms. He moved his feet nervously, uncertain of what to say at first. Then he murmured, "Am I really free to go?" "Of course," said the bishop. "But this time you mustn't forget your candlesticks." He fetched them from a shelf and gave them to Valjean. "Now go in peace," he said softly. The policeman left, but Valjean did not move. He did not know what to think. The bishop walked up to him and said in a low voice, "Don't forget that you've promised to use the money to make yourself an honest man." Valjean, who did not remember having made such a promise, was silent. "Jean Valjean," the bishop continued, "I've bought your soul from the devil and have given it to God." Jean Valjean left the town and ran into the countryside, blindly following lanes and paths, not realizing that he was running in circles. He was filled with a strange kind of anger, but he did not know why. Finally, as evening fell, he sat on the ground, exhausted, and gazed across the fields at the distant mountains, wishing that he was back in prison. When he had been angry at the world, he had felt calm and sure of himself. But now, for the first time in 20 years, a man had shown him great kindness, and he did not know what to feel. Suddenly he heard the sound of singing. A boy of about 10 years old was coming along a footpath with a small box on his back, and dirty knees showing through holes in his trousers. As he sang, he threw a coin into the air and caught it before it fell. Not noticing Jean Valjean sitting by the side of the path, he threw the coin higher into the air. This time, however, he did not catch it, and it rolled along the ground towards Valjean, who immediately put his foot on it. The boy, unafraid, walked up to Valjean. "Please, monsieur, may I have my coin?" "What's your name?" asked Valjean. "Petit Gervais," said the boy, smiling trustfully. "I'm a chimney sweep, and that money's all I have." "Go away," said Valjean. "Please, monsieur, that's my money." Valjean lowered his head and did not reply. "My money!" the boy cried. "My piece of silver, my coin!" Valjean seemed not to hear him. The boy seized his collar and shook him. "I want my money!" he cried. Valjean slowly raised his head and stared with a sort of amazement at the child. Then, reaching for his stick, he said, "Go to hell!" The boy, suddenly afraid of the mad, fierce look in Valjean's eyes, turned and ran. Valjean stood for some time gazing emptily around him at the sunset and the shadows moving in on him. Suddenly he shivered, as if he had become aware for the first time of the icy wind. He bent down to pick up his bag, but, as he did so, he caught sight of the silver coin, half buried by his foot in the earth. It affected him like an electric shock. "What's that?" he murmured. He stared at the coin with a look of puzzlement, as if he were trying to remember something. Then, with a sudden movement, he bent down and picked it up. He looked around, but could see nothing in the darkness, just a purple mist rising slowly from the fields. He called the boy's name, but there was no reply. Within minutes he was running along the path, shouting, "Petit Gervais! Petit Gervais!" There was still no reply. A short time later he met a priest on horseback. "Have you seen a boy go by?" he asked. The priest shook his head. "No. Why do you ask?" Valjean produced 2 5-franc pieces and gave them to the priest. "This is for your poor, monsieur. He was a boy of about 10, a chimney sweep. Monsieur, you must report me to the police. I'm a thief. I stole money from him. Here, let me give you more money." But before Valjean could produce more coins, the priest rode away in terror. Valjean looked for the boy for another hour, running along the path, calling out his name, but with no success. Finally he stopped and sat exhausted on a rock. Then, his heart full of grief for what he had done, he buried his face in his hands, and for the first time in 19 years, he cried. Chapter 2. Fantine. On a spring evening in 1818, in the village of Montfermeil, not far from Paris, two little girls were playing on a swing outside a small inn. Their mother, a big, red-haired woman with a plain face, sat on the doorstep of the inn watching them. "You have two very pretty children, madame," a voice said from close beside her. The woman looked round and saw a young woman with a child sleeping peacefully in her arms. The mother was young and pretty, but she looked poor and unhappy. She did not smile, and lines of sadness ran down the side of her pale cheeks. Her clothes were old and dirty, and she wore a tight, plain cap over her beautiful blonde hair. "Thank you," said the woman. "Why don't you sit down for a minute? You look tired." When the young woman had sat down next to her, the red-haired woman introduced herself. "My name's Thénardier. My husband and I manage this inn." "My name's Fantine," the young woman said. "I used to work in Paris, but my husband died, and I lost my job." She could not tell Madame Thénardier the truth, which was that she had been made pregnant by a young man who had then abandoned her. "I left Paris this morning to look for work in Montreuil," she continued. "My little girl walked some of the way, but she's very small. I had to carry her, and she's fallen asleep." As she spoke these words, she gave her daughter a loving kiss, which woke her up. The child's eyes were as wide and blue as her mother's. With a little laugh, she jumped off her mother's lap and ran to play with the two girls on the swing. "What's your little girl's name?" Madame Thénardier asked. "Euphrasie. But I call her Cosette. She's nearly 3. The two women watched the children playing together. "Children make friends very easily, don't they?" Madame Thénardier smiled. "Look at them. They could easily be sisters." At these words, Fantine did a very strange thing. She took Madame Thénardier's hand and said, "Will you look after my daughter for me?" Madame Thénardier looked at Fantine thoughtfully, but said nothing. "I can't take her with me," Fantine continued. "I have to find work, and that's not easy with a child but no husband. As soon as I find a job, I'll come and fetch her. Will you do that for me? I could pay 6 francs a month." Madame Thénardier still said nothing. But a man's voice from inside the house called, "We'll take 7 francs a month and 6 months in advance." Fantine agreed. "And another 15 francs for extras," called the man. "You will have them," said Fantine, assuming that she was talking to Madame Thénardier's husband. "I have 80 francs. "Does the child have enough clothes?" the man asked. "She has some beautiful clothes," Fantine replied. "Plenty of everything, and silk dresses like a lady. They're all in my bag." The man's face finally appeared in the doorway. "Then we agree to look after her for you," he said. The next morning Fantine kissed her daughter goodbye and left for Montreuil, crying as if her heart would break. "This money will be useful," Thénardier said to his wife. "Now I can pay off all my debts and stay out of prison. I'm proud of you. You set a very clever trap."
"Without even intending to," his wife replied.
1 month later, Thénardier was short of money again, so he took Cosette's beautiful silk clothes to Paris and sold them for 60 francs. The couple dressed Cosette in rags and gave her very little food, which they made her eat from a wooden bowl under the table. The dog and the cat, who ate with her, were her only companions. Fantine, meanwhile, found work in Montreuil and asked for news of her daughter every month. The Thénardiers always replied that she was in good health and very happy. At the end of the year, however, Thénardier was not happy with just 7 francs a month. He demanded 12, and Fantine paid without protest, happy that her daughter was being well cared for. The Thénardiers, who were loving and gentle to their own daughters, Éponine and Azelma, treated Cosette like a slave. They made her get up before dawn every day and do all the dirty jobs around the house, while Éponine and Azelma wore pretty clothes and played with dolls. By the age of 5, Cosette had become a thin, pale-faced, silent child. Misery had made her ugly, and only her beautiful blue eyes remained. The Thénardiers did not feel guilty about treating Cosette badly, because Fantine had stopped sending them regular payments. "The child is lucky to have a home at all," they told everybody. "Without us, she'd be living on the streets." When Fantine first arrived in Montreuil, she had immediately found work in a factory. She rented a small room, sent money regularly to the Thénardiers, and for a short time was almost happy. She forgot many of her problems, and dreamt only of Cosette and her plans for the future. But her happiness did not last long. Although she was careful to say nothing about her daughter to anyone, other women at the factory soon discovered her secret. An unmarried woman with a child was a terrible thing in those days, and Fantine lost her job. She tried to find work as a servant, but no one would employ her. She finally managed to earn a little money sewing shirts, but she was unable to send money regularly to the Thénardiers. That winter, Fantine saved money by not having a fire, and developed a small, dry cough. By the following winter, her debts had increased. The Thénardiers wrote her a frightening letter in which they told her that Cosette had no clothes, and that they needed 10 francs immediately to buy her a new dress. Fantine, who did not have 10 francs, but who was afraid that her daughter would freeze to death, went to the barber's shop. She took out her comb and let her blonde hair fall down to her waist. "Such beautiful hair," the barber said. "How much will you give me for it?" Fantine asked. 10 francs. "Then cut it off." After selling her hair to the barber, Fantine was able to buy a woolen dress, which she sent to the Thénardiers. The Thénardiers, however, were very angry. They had wanted money, not clothes. They gave the dress to their daughter Éponine, and Cosette went on shivering. A few weeks later, Fantine received another letter from the Thénardiers. This time, they wanted 40 francs, because Cosette was very ill and urgently needed medicine. Fantine felt desperate. She did not know how to obtain such a large sum of money. As she was wandering around the town, desperately trying to decide what to do, she noticed a crowd of people in the market square. She approached them without thinking, and discovered that they had gathered around a travelling dentist. Forgetting her troubles for a moment, she smiled at the dentist's humorous efforts to sell the people of Montreuil false teeth. Suddenly, the dentist saw her. "You've got lovely teeth," he said. "If you sold me your 2 front teeth, I'd pay you 40 francs. Fantine ran home, upset and disgusted. "My hair will grow again," she thought, "but teeth would be gone forever." But then she thought about her daughter, and her own appearance suddenly seemed unimportant. That evening she visited the dentist at the inn where he was staying, and allowed him to remove her teeth. Fantine could not sleep that night. She sat on her bed, cold and shivering, and looked at the 2 coins shining on the table. Then she gave a blood-stained smile. "I'm happy," she told herself. "My baby isn't going to die." Fantine earned less and less money from her sewing, and the Thénardiers demanded more and more money to look after Cosette. Fantine spent whole nights crying. What could she do? She had sold her hair and her teeth. What else could she sell? And then she decided that she had no other choice. She would have to sell herself. She became a prostitute. Chapter 3. Monsieur Madeleine. One winter's evening, a toothless woman with a grey face and flowers in her hair was arrested for attacking a man in the street. She was taken to the police station, where Inspector Javert, the chief of police, sent her to prison for 6 months. "Please, Monsieur Javert." The woman fell to her knees. "I owe 100 francs. If I don't pay, my little girl will lose her home and be thrown out onto the streets. Please, don't send me to prison." Javert listened to her coldly, then ordered a policeman to take her away. While the policeman was trying to drag her to her feet, however, a voice from the shadows said, "One moment, please." Javert looked up and saw Monsieur Madeleine, one of the most important people in the town. Monsieur Madeleine had arrived mysteriously in Montreuil one December evening in 1815. He had no money, but he had a revolutionary idea. He knew a cheap and efficient method of manufacturing glass. Within a few months of his arrival, thanks to his new idea, the glass-making factory in Montreuil was making enormous profits. With the money he made, Monsieur Madeleine built 2 new factories, which provided the town with hundreds of new jobs. He became a very wealthy man, but lived a simple life, using most of his money to build new hospitals and schools. He was so popular that in 1820 the townspeople elected him mayor of Montreuil. There was one man, however, who did not like Monsieur Madeleine. This was the chief of police, Inspector Javert. He had always been suspicious of Monsieur Madeleine, and was sure that he had seen him somewhere before, many years earlier. But he kept his suspicions to himself, not daring to say what he really believed. that Monsieur Madeleine was, in fact, a dangerous criminal with a terrible past. Now, years later, Monsieur Madeleine was in the police station, trying to save Fantine from prison. Fantine, however, was not grateful. In fact, when she saw who it was, she spat at him.
"You own the factory where I used to work," she shouted at him. "I lost my job because of you. Now, I've become a bad woman. But what choice did I have? I'll never get my daughter back if I don't make money."
The mayor turned to Inspector Javert and said in a soft, firm voice, "This woman must be released."
"That's impossible," Javert replied. "She attacked a man in the street, a respectable citizen. And now I've just seen her spit at you, the mayor of our town. A woman like this deserves to be punished."
"But I saw what happened in the street just now," Monsieur Madeleine said. "It was the man's fault, not this woman's. You should arrest him, not her." Javert argued with Monsieur Madeleine for some time, but finally gave in. He walked angrily out of the room, leaving the mayor and the prostitute alone together. Fantine trembled, as confused as Javert had been. The man who had just saved her from prison was also the man who had caused all her troubles. The devil had suddenly decided to be kind, and she did not know what to think. "I heard what you said," Monsieur Madeleine said to her. "I honestly didn't know that you had lost your job. But I'll try to help you now. I'll pay your debts and arrange for your child to return to you. I'll give you all the money you need. I'll make you happy again. And I promise that in the eyes of God, you have never been a bad woman." Fantine gazed at Monsieur Madeleine with tears in her eyes. After all her pain and suffering, she had, for the first time in her life, found kindness in another human being. At last she would be cared for, and she could look forward to a life of happiness with Cosette. Without a word, she fell to her knees and kissed the back of Monsieur Madeleine's hand. Monsieur Madeleine sent the Thénardiers 300 francs, and told them to send Cosette to Montreuil immediately. Thénardier, thinking that Fantine had suddenly become rich, wrote back and demanded 500 francs. Monsieur Madeleine sent the money, but the Thénardiers found even more dishonest excuses for not sending Cosette back. The weeks passed, and although she was happier than she had been for a long time, Fantine caught a fever. Months of poverty and misery had made her ill, and she soon became so weak that she was unable to leave her bed.
"When shall I see Cosette?"
she kept asking Monsieur Madeleine when he visited her. "Very soon," he would reply, and her pale face would light up with joy. One morning, as Monsieur Madeleine was making preparations to leave for Montfermeil, and to fetch Cosette himself, he had a visitor. Inspector Javert walked into his office, and stood in silence, waiting for him to look up from his work. "Well, Javert, what is it?" Monsieur Madeleine finally said. "I've come to apologize, Monsieur Madeleine," the inspector replied. "What are you talking about?" "I've treated you unjustly. I was angry with you 6 weeks ago when you told me to release that woman. I wrote to the police headquarters in Paris and told them about you." Told them what about me?
Forgive me, Monsieur Madeleine, but I believed you were a man called Jean Valjean. He was a prisoner I saw 20 years ago when I worked at a prison in Toulon. After being released from prison, this Valjean stole some silver from the Bishop of Digne and robbed a small boy on a public footpath. We tried to catch him, but he disappeared. When you arrived in Montreuil, I felt sure that you were this man. But now I know I was wrong, and I'm sorry. You will, of course, dismiss me from my job, as I've shown that I don't deserve your trust.
Monsieur Madeleine, looking hard at Javert without expression, said quietly, "I'm afraid I don't understand."
The police headquarters in Paris told me that Jean Valjean was arrested last autumn for stealing apples, Javert explained. He'd changed his name to Champmathieu, and had lived for several years in the village of Ailly-aux-Cloches. 2 ex-prisoners from Toulon recognized him as Jean Valjean. I visited the man in Arras prison, and I saw for myself that he is indeed Jean Valjean. Of course, he denies everything, but that's not surprising. If he's found guilty of stealing from the bishop, who, as you know, died a couple of years ago, and of robbing the small boy, he'll spend the rest of his life in prison.
Monsieur Madeleine looked down at his papers. "This matter is of no interest to me, Javert," he said casually. "I'm sure you have other work to do."
"I was going to the man's trial in Arras tomorrow," Javert said. "But after this conversation you must dismiss me."
Monsieur Madeleine rose to his feet. "Javert," he said, "you're an honourable man. You made one small mistake, that's all. I want you to continue your excellent work as Inspector of Police." He offered Javert his hand, but the inspector refused to take it. Instead, he said,
"I've behaved unjustly towards an innocent man. I cannot shake his hand."
With those words, he bowed and left the office, leaving Monsieur Madeleine to stare at the papers on his desk with an empty, puzzled look in his eyes. That afternoon, Monsieur Madeleine visited Fantine. She had a high fever and was coughing badly, but she still had only one thing on her mind. "Cosette?" she asked him. "Very soon," he assured her. He sat by her bed for an hour, and then, having told the nurses to look after her, he returned to his home. He stayed awake all night, thinking of Javert's story about Champmathieu. The reader has probably already realized that Monsieur Madeleine was really Jean Valjean, and Monsieur Madeleine, as we shall continue to call him for this part of the story, knew that he could not let Champmathieu go to prison for crimes he had not committed. He knew, although he was not happy to admit this, that he would have to go to Arras and tell the truth. He would lose everything that he had worked so hard to achieve. He would also have to break his promise to Fantine about bringing Cosette from Montfermeil. But what choice did he have? The truth was more important than anything else. The next morning, Monsieur Madeleine set off on the long journey to Arras. It took him more than 12 hours, and when he arrived, he discovered that Champmathieu's trial had already started. The courtroom was full, but because he was such an important man, Monsieur Madeleine was allowed to sit behind the judge's chair. He watched as several witnesses swore on the Bible that the man standing before the judge was Jean Valjean. Champmathieu, a large, simple-minded man, denied everything when his chance came to speak, but the crowd thought he was trying to be funny. The courtroom filled with laughter, and Champmathieu began to laugh himself, which did him no good at all. Finally, having heard all the evidence, the judge called for silence. He was preparing to announce his decision when Monsieur Madeleine, pale and trembling, stood up and said, "That man is not Jean Valjean." An excited whisper went around the courtroom as everybody recognized Monsieur Madeleine. Monsieur Madeleine waited for the whispers to stop, before announcing in a loud, clear voice that he was Jean Valjean. At first, no one believed him, but he managed to persuade the court by skillfully questioning each of the witnesses, revealing personal information that only the real Jean Valjean could have known. When he had persuaded the court of the truth of his confession, he was faced with a shocked but respectful silence. "I must leave now," Monsieur Madeleine finally said. "I have important business to attend to. You know where to find me, and I shall not try to escape." Everybody stood to one side to let him pass as he made his way towards the door. When he had gone, the judge immediately allowed Champmathieu to leave the court a free man. Champmathieu went home in a state of total confusion, thinking all men mad and understanding nothing of what had happened. At dawn the next day, Monsieur Madeleine entered Fantine's room. "How is she?" he asked the nurse who was watching her as she slept. "She seems better. She's looking forward to seeing her child." "I haven't brought the child with me," Monsieur Madeleine said. "Then what can we say to her when she wakes up?" The nurse looked suddenly worried. "It will destroy her if she doesn't see her child now, after you promised to bring her." "God will guide me," Monsieur Madeleine sighed. For some time Monsieur Madeleine sat by the bedside and watched Fantine while she slept. She was breathing with great difficulty, but her face looked peaceful and calm. Suddenly she opened her eyes and saw Monsieur Madeleine. "Cosette?" she asked, with a soft smile. "Later," Monsieur Madeleine said gently, taking her hand. "You're too weak to see her at the moment. First you must get well." Fantine smiled, and began to talk dreamily about her future life with her daughter, and how happy they would be together. But suddenly her face froze, and she stared with horror at the door. Monsieur Madeleine, who was holding her hand, turned and saw Inspector Javert. Fantine, thinking that the inspector had come for her, gripped Monsieur Madeleine's hand tightly and begged him to protect her. "Don't be afraid." Monsieur Madeleine tried to calm her. "He hasn't come for you." Then, gently rising from his chair, he moved towards Javert. "I know what you've come for," he said quietly so that Fantine wouldn't hear. "But give me 3 days, please. That's all I ask. 3 days to fetch this unfortunate woman's child. I'll pay anything you like." "Do you think I'm stupid?" Javert gave an unpleasant laugh. 3 days to escape, you mean?" Fantine, who had heard what Monsieur Madeleine said despite his efforts to speak quietly, began to tremble.
"To fetch my child?" she cried. "Isn't she here? Nurse, answer me. Where's my little Cosette? I want to see her, Monsieur Madeleine."
"Be quiet, you dirty prostitute!" Javert interrupted her angrily. "There is no Monsieur Madeleine. This man's name is Jean Valjean, and he's a criminal no better than you are, and you can forget all that nonsense about your child." Fantine suddenly sat up. She stared wildly at the two men, then turned to the nurse. She looked as if she was going to speak, but no words came from her lips. Instead, with a small sigh, she fell back against her pillow and lay completely still. Jean Valjean, as we must now call him, shook Javert's hand from his collar and ran to the bed. He gazed into Fantine's eyes and knew immediately that she was dead. "You've killed her!" he cried angrily, turning to Javert with a fierce look in his eyes. "I didn't come here to argue," Javert said, stepping back nervously, afraid that Valjean was going to attack him. "If you don't come with me now, I'll have to call my men." Valjean looked around the room, thinking for a second of making his escape. But the idea did not last for long. He turned again to Fantine and looked for one last time at her sad, pale face and empty blue eyes. Bending down, he closed her eyes and pressed his lips against her forehead. Then he rose and turned back to Javert. "I'm ready now," he said. News of Monsieur Madeleine's arrest spread quickly around the town. Most people pretended not to be surprised. "We always knew there was something strange about him," they said. 2 days after his arrest, Jean Valjean escaped from prison. The bars of his window had been broken during the night. Again, most people pretended not to be surprised. "It takes more than a small-town prison to hold a man as strong as that," they all agreed. Chapter 4. The Man in the Long Yellow Coat. Christmas 1823 was especially lively and colourful in the village of Montfermeil. Entertainers and traders from Paris set up their stalls in the streets, and business at the Thénardiers' inn was very good. While guests and visitors ate and drank noisily, Cosette, now 8 years old, sat in her usual place under the kitchen table. Dressed in rags, she knitted woolen stockings for Éponine and Azelma. One evening, Madame Thénardier ordered Cosette out into the cold to fetch water. The nearest water supply was halfway down the wooded hill on which Montfermeil stood, and Cosette hated fetching water, especially in the dark. Miserably, she picked up a large empty bucket that was almost as big as she was, and was walking with it to the door when Madame Thénardier stopped her. "Buy some bread on the way," she said, giving the girl some money. Cosette took the coin, put it carefully in her pocket, and left. She was cold and hungry as she dragged the bucket behind her along the crowded street. But she could not resist stopping in front of one of the stalls. It was like a palace to her, with its bright lights, shining glass, and pretty objects. But the object that most attracted Cosette's attention was a large golden-haired doll in a beautiful long pink dress. All the children in Montfermeil had gazed with wonder at this doll, but nobody in the village had enough money to buy it. Cosette gazed at the doll for several minutes, but remembering her job, she sighed and continued on her way. She had soon left the colourful lights and the happy laughter of the village behind her, and was running down the hill into the frightening darkness of the wood. Finding the stream, she bent forward and began to fill her bucket. She did not notice the coin that Madame Thénardier had given her for the bread fall out of her pocket into the water. When the bucket was full, she gripped the handle with her tiny frozen hands and tried to pull it back up the hill. But the bucket was so heavy that after a dozen steps she had to stop for a rest. She managed a few more steps and stopped again. Her progress became slower and slower. She was almost at the end of her strength, and she was still not out of the wood. Leaning against a tree, she cried aloud, "Oh, God, help me! Please, dear God!" Suddenly, an enormous hand reached down from the sky and took the bucket of water from her. Looking up, Cosette saw a huge, white-haired man standing next to her. He looked very strange, with his tall black hat and long yellow coat. "This is a very heavy bucket for such a small child," he said gently, looking down at her from his great height. For some reason, Cosette was not afraid. There was something about his eyes, filled with a strange sadness, that she liked and trusted. She let him carry the bucket up the hill, and as they walked back towards the village, she told him everything about her life with the Thénardier. The old man listened with great interest, and asked her many questions. As they were approaching the inn, Cosette turned to him and said, "May I have the bucket now? If Madame Thénardier sees that someone has been helping me, she'll beat me." The old man gave her the bucket, and they entered the inn together. "What took you so long?" Madame Thénardier said angrily when she saw the little girl. "This gentleman wants a room for the night," Cosette said, trembling with fear, expecting to be beaten. Madame Thénardier glanced at the old man without interest. She could tell from his clothes that he probably had no money. "I'm sorry, the rooms are full," she said. "I can pay the price of a room," the old man said. 40 sous, Madame Thénardier replied, although the usual price was 20. 40 sous, the man agreed. He sat down, and Cosette, after serving him some wine, returned to her place under the table. But before she could start her knitting, she heard Madame Thénardier's angry voice demanding, "Where's the bread I told you to get?" Cosette, who had forgotten about the bread, came out from under the table. "The baker's was shut," she lied. "Well, give me back the money." Cosette felt in her pocket and suddenly went pale. The coin was not there. "I'm waiting," Madame Thénardier said threateningly. Cosette said nothing, speechless with fear as the woman raised her arm to hit her. But before she could deliver the blow, the old man, who had seen everything, interrupted her. "Madame, I've just noticed this on the floor. It must have fallen from the child's pocket." Madame Thénardier took the coin the old man held towards her and walked away. At that moment, the door opened and Éponine and Azelma appeared. They were two healthy girls, the old man noticed, dressed in warm clothes and with pink, healthy cheeks. After hugging and kissing their mother, they sat on the floor by the fire and played with a doll. Cosette, who had returned to her place under the table, looked up from her knitting and watched them sadly. A short time later the girls grew bored with their game. They left the doll on the floor and went off to play with a baby cat. Cosette, checking that no one was watching, reached out and picked up the doll. She turned her back on the room and began to play with it, hoping that no one could see what she was doing. Her happiness did not last long, however. The two girls, when they saw Cosette with their doll, ran crying to their mother. Madame Thénardier rushed across the room towards Cosette, who, afraid that she would be punished, put the doll gently on the floor and began to cry. "What's the matter?" the old man said, rising to his feet. "Can't you see?" Madame Thénardier said, red with anger. "That nasty little girl, who isn't even my own daughter, who I feed and look after out of the kindness of my heart, has been playing with my daughter's doll." "I don't understand," the old man said. "She's touched it with her dirty hands." Then, hearing Cosette crying, she turned to the little girl and shouted, "Stop that noise!" The old man left the inn, and minutes later returned with something in his hands. The beautiful doll from the stall across the road. "Here," he said softly, placing it gently on the floor in front of Cosette. "It's for you." There was a sudden silence in the room. Madame Thénardier, Éponine, and Azelma stood absolutely still. The drinkers at the other tables paused, glasses halfway to their lips, and stared with disbelief. "What kind of man is this?" they thought. "He dresses so poorly, but can afford to buy the most expensive doll in Montfermeil." The Thénardiers gave the old man their best room for the night. The next morning they gave him the bill, charging him 3 times the usual price for a meal and a bed for the night. They waited nervously while the man studied the bill carefully, expecting him to complain or cause trouble. Finally, he looked up from the bill without expression and said, "Tell me, is business good here in Montfermeil?" "Times are very hard," Madame Thénardier replied immediately. "This is a poor country. I don't know how we would manage without the occasional rich and generous traveller like yourself. We have so many expenses. That child, for instance, you've no idea how much she costs. We have our own daughters to look after. I can't afford to look after other people's children too." "What would you say," the old man said after a moment's thought, "if I offered to take the child from you?" "Oh," Madame Thénardier's face brightened. "That would be wonderful." "Just a minute," her husband said. "We love that child very much. It's true we're poor, and we have bad debts, but love is more important than money." "How much do you need?" the old man asked, taking an old leather wallet from the pocket of his coat. 1,500 francs, Thénardier, who had already done his arithmetic, replied. The old man put 3 500-franc notes on the table and said, without smiling, "Now fetch Cosette." When Cosette came downstairs, the old man gave her new clothes to wear, a black woolen dress, black stockings, scarf, and shoes. Half an hour later, the people of Montfermeil saw an old man in a tall hat and long yellow coat walking along the road to Paris, hand in hand with a little girl dressed completely in black. No one knew the man. And because she was carrying an expensive doll and was no longer wearing rags, not many recognized Cosette. Cosette was leaving at last. She did not know where to or with whom. But as she held the old man's hand, she gazed wide-eyed at the sky. She had the strange but comforting feeling that she was somehow travelling closer to God. Chapter 5. Valjean and Cosette. Somewhere on the outskirts of Paris, Jean Valjean stopped outside a large ancient building with damp walls. He took a key from the pocket of his long yellow coat and opened the old wooden door. He then carried Cosette, who was sleeping in his arms, along a dark corridor and up some stairs to the room he had rented since his escape from Montreuil. There was not much furniture in the room, just an old bed, a mattress on the floor, a table, some chairs, and a lighted stove. A street lamp shone through the only window, lighting the dark interior of the room. Valjean laid Cosette on the bed without waking her. He lit a candle and sat by the bed, watching her while she slept. He felt sad that Fantine had not lived to see her child again, but happy that he had been able to rescue her child from the terrible Thénardiers. He bent and kissed the sleeping child's forehead, just as 9 months earlier he had kissed her mother's. The next morning Cosette opened her eyes and immediately started to get out of bed. "I'm coming, madame," she yawned, blinded by the bright winter sunlight that was shining into the room. Then, as her eyes adjusted to the light, she saw the kind old face of Jean Valjean looking down at her, and she relaxed. "Of course," she cried with joy. "It's all true. I was afraid that it was just a dream." She hugged her doll and asked Valjean hundreds of questions. Finally she asked him, "Do you want me to sweep the floor?" "No," he said. "I just want you to enjoy yourself." The December days passed in great happiness for Cosette and for Jean Valjean too. For 25 years he had been alone in the world. Nothing had ever touched his heart until he had rescued Cosette. Now he discovered the greatest joy he had ever known by just standing beside her bed and looking at her innocent, trusting little face. He had discovered love. After escaping from Montreuil, Jean Valjean had taken all his money from the bank and buried it in a forest near Montfermeil. Although he was rich, he had chosen a room in a poor part of Paris where nobody would find him. His only neighbour was an old woman who did his housework and kept his stove burning. Paying her 6 months in advance, he told her that he was a ruined Spanish gentleman and that the little girl was his granddaughter. Weeks passed, and the two lived happily. Valjean gave Cosette lessons in reading and writing, and spent hours watching her as she dressed and undressed her doll. To avoid being seen, he never went out during the day. He walked for a couple of hours every evening, sometimes alone, sometimes with Cosette. He often gave money to beggars, which was unwise because he soon became known in the area as the beggar who gives money to beggars. One evening towards the end of winter, Valjean gave some money to a beggar sitting under a street lamp outside a church. The beggar raised his face and stared hard at Valjean for just a second, then quickly bowed his head. This gave Valjean a shock. Although he had only seen the beggar's face for a second, It had seemed strangely familiar. "I'm going mad," he thought as he walked home. The next evening he returned to the street lamp outside the church. The beggar was still there, in the same position, wearing the same clothes. This time Valjean spoke to him as he gave him some money. The beggar laughed and joked with him, and Valjean returned that evening a happier man. "I must have been dreaming yesterday," he laughed to himself. "But for a second there was something about the beggar's eyes that reminded me of Javert. How could I have thought such a thing? After speaking to him this evening, I can see that he doesn't look like the inspector at all." A few evenings later, while he was giving Cosette a reading lesson in his room, Valjean heard the front door of the house open and close. This was unusual. The old woman, the only other person who lived in the building, always went to bed before nightfall. Valjean signalled to Cosette to keep quiet. Someone was coming up the stairs. He blew out the candle, and just as he was kissing Cosette on the forehead, the footsteps stopped. Valjean did not move. He sat in his chair with his back to the door and held his breath. A few minutes later, having heard only silence, he turned round. A light was shining through a crack in his door. Someone with a candle was standing outside his room. Several minutes passed, and then the light disappeared. Valjean quietly lay down on the mattress on his floor, but he could not close his eyes all night. At daybreak, as he was falling asleep at last, he heard footsteps in the corridor outside his room again. Running to the door, he put his eye to the large keyhole, and saw the back view of a man who was walking towards the stairs. A tall man, in a long coat, with a stick under his arm. Valjean's heart almost stopped beating, and he began to sweat. "Javert," he breathed to himself. Valjean spent all day making preparations to leave. It was too dangerous for him and Cosette to stay there another night. That evening he went downstairs and looked up and down the street. It seemed empty, although he could not see into the shadows behind the trees. He went back upstairs for Cosette, who was waiting for him patiently, holding her doll. "Come along," he said. "It's time to leave." Cosette took his hand and went with him down the stairs. There was a full moon, and this pleased Valjean as he moved quickly along the narrow streets. By keeping close to the walls in the shadows, he could clearly see what was happening in the light. After a while, he felt confident that he and Cosette were not being followed. But as the church bells of the city struck 11 o'clock, something made him look back. In the light of a lamp above a doorway, he saw 4 men moving along the street in his direction. He gripped Cosette's hand and began to walk more quickly. Every few minutes, he stopped in the shadows of a doorway or at the corner of the street to look back. The 4 men were still following him. He could see their faces clearly in the moonlight, and one of them belonged to Inspector Javert. By now, Cosette was exhausted. Valjean picked her up and ran with her through a confusing system of alleys until he came to a bridge. On the other side of the river, he stopped at the entrance of a high-walled alley and looked back. He could see 4 figures in the distance on the far side of the bridge. Walking more slowly now, thinking he was safe from his pursuers, Valjean followed the alley until he came to a lane that seemed to lead away from the city. He walked along this lane for a long time until, to his horror, he discovered his way blocked by a high wall. There was no way forward. But as he was turning back, he saw movements in the distance and the flash of moonlight on metal. 7 or 8 soldiers were moving slowly along the lane in his direction. Valjean looked desperately for an escape from the alley, but could see none. On one side of him was a tall building, all its doors and windows covered with metal bars. On the other side, there was a wall, higher than a tree. He would be able to climb the wall on his own, but how could he carry Cosette? Suddenly he had an idea. He ran to a nearby street light and pulled some wire from a metal box at its base. He tied one end of the wire around Cosette's waist, climbed the wall, and, with great difficulty, pulled the girl up behind him. He was only just in time. There was a tree on the other side of the wall, and Valjean carried Cosette down into its branches, just as the soldiers arrived. "He must be here," he heard Javert's voice clearly on the other side of the wall. "He can't have escaped. There's no way out." At last, the soldiers gave up their search and went back in the direction they had come. Valjean hugged Cosette tightly with relief, knowing that at last they were both safe.